Boy, can you believe it? We're on week 12 already. This semester is going by really fast now. 4 more weeks left, and then we're done. And that's even with half a week for Thanksgiving in there, too. So, man, this semester is really cruising by. So, some really interesting things have happened this week. Really, again, we're getting to a point where we're kind of settling in on, okay, we've got to get everything done and get ready for finals for the end of the semester, and then work around, of course, the Thanksgiving break. So today I want to talk about my research paper first. I've been getting some feedback on my research paper, and a lot of the feedback is confirming something that I noticed as I was reading through it, and that was that there's a disconnect in the paper. So what I'm doing now is I got to go back and redo a bunch of stuff on my paper. And this is not an uncommon thing. If you do a research paper, oftentimes your first draft is just getting the information onto the paper. And then from there, you start to refine it and improve it. And so there's a bit of a disconnect in the paper. And so I'm going back and looking at how do I narrow this down more. If you remember from the early couple of weeks of the semester, I was really taking my research and narrowing it down. And I thought I hit a really nice spot that I wrote my paper about, but it's not narrow enough, apparently. So I'm going to narrow it down a little bit further, which leads me to some of the things I want to talk about today from British history. When it comes to LDS practices, LDS worship and things in England, they faced some tremendous opposition. We've talked about word of wisdom, we've talked about tithing issues and things that happened with that. But today, what we're going to talk about is some other problems that they faced as well. That was just it was so wild to hear some of the stories and things they had. A lot of opposition from the government, and so this is where I'm going to focus more of my paper. I believe I'm still trying to get all the research gathered and reread a bunch of stuff, redo things. But I think what I'm going to do is focus on the idea of so most of what we've talked about so far. So I got a lot of ideas on this. Most of what we've talked about has been focused on indirect legal influence on church worship, like the Beer Act of 1830. Or some of the economic decisions that they made with the Corn Laws in 1836 and others, and that affected the depressions and economic problems that they faced. So those are like indirect situations where the law shaped the society and that caused problems later on. It wasn't meant to cause problems, but it just happened that way, basically. There was a time when some people in Parliament wanted to actually pass laws that hurt the church directly, more specifically banning LDS missionaries from England entirely. And there was a concerted effort to get this to happen. So in the early 1900s, there was a rumor that started to be spread, and part of it was due to German influence as well, was because in the early 1900s and during the 1800s, LDS philosophy was based around Zion. Come to Zion. Zion was in Salt Lake City. So come to where the church is headquartered, which encouraged a tremendous amount of migration from a lot of European areas to come to Utah. It wasn't until in the 1900s that changed. And the church says, no, stop coming to Utah, stay, build Zion in your area. And there's a big shift in how we thought about Zion at that time. In England, a lot of people, they would join the church, and then a lot of them would just migrate. So like branches and wards and districts and conferences in England often stayed really small because people were migrating to Utah. Those who didn't or couldn't stayed. And so you'd have these little branches that would only have like 50 members, and they would be that way for decades. Because even though there's new people being baptized in the area all the time, they're migrating. They're leaving England, leaving the country and going to America. So this kept the numbers relatively low for attendance and things over there. So rumors started to fly because of polygamy. And if you're familiar with church history, polygamy was a big deal from the 1850s. Early 1850s is when Brigham Young became more public about talking about polygamy, and then it was after the 1860s, after the Civil War, that the American government started to push back against polygamy and pass anti-polygamy laws and things. A lot of that really came. It really resurged again in the early 1900s with what's known as the Reed-Smoot trial. Reed-Smoot is a LDS apostle in the early 1900s who ran successfully to be in the U.S. Senate for the state of Utah. And so he won his election. And so when he went back to Washington, D.C. to take his seat in the U.S. Senate and be sworn in, there was a huge uprising of people who said, we don't want him in here. And part of it, a lot of it really was, he's Mormon and they are still at odds with the rest of the government on polygamy issues. Now, Reed-Smoot was not a polygamist. He did not have more than one wife. He had only had the one wife. And so some of those claims against him were unfounded. But man, did it make a sensation in the news all over the world. It was believed that because of this idea of polygamy was still kind of, are you sure is it really gone? The manifesto in the 1890s says that polygamy is no longer taught or allowed in the Mormon church, but there were still evidences of some polygamous relationships still happening, new marriages still happening through the 1890s and early 1900s. So that's what really happened is Reed-Smoot trial. And they actually got the prophet, Joseph Fielding Smith, on stand in Congress testifying for about 3 days, and they grilled him about polygamy. And so that's when he issued the second manifesto against it, and that's when it became an excommunicatable offense in the LDS church. So in Europe, this just led to these ideas of, hey, if there's a lot of women who are leaving Europe to go to America, they must be going for polygamous relationships. So there was this assumption that was made, and Germany actually expelled all their missionaries in the early 1900s. England saw this and started to investigate it in England as well. So there was already, there's always been opposition to the LDS Church. They've always had some anti-Mormon people out there. A lot of leaders of other churches have been pushing back against the Mormon Church since 1837 when they arrived, when Heber C. Kimball got off the boat with a set of missionaries and began the British mission. So they've had some opposition. Like I think I mentioned last time that the first book of Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet, is about a man and a young woman escaping polygamy in Utah. So it was kind of an anti-Mormon book, sort of. It wasn't an explicit anti-Mormon book, but it was building a story about these things happening and escaping polygamy and how evil and bad the Mormons were. There was another woman, Winifred Graham. She came up with some things she started writing what were called sixpenny novels. She wrote up a bunch of them during the late 1890s, early 1900s time frame. I think she did 8 anti-Mormon books basically during that time. And she created a huge sensation against the Mormon Church. So around 1910, 1911, the British Parliament actually started to say, we need to investigate this. Is this true? Is it really legit that there are people, that the Mormon missionaries are just here to steal the women, British women away, basically? There were some pamphlets that had been published on top of Winifred Graham's books. There was a reverend who found that he was missing, women were starting to go missing from his congregation, only to find out they joined the Mormon Church and left England. So he wrote some pamphlets about it. In fact, in 1910, his pamphlets created a riot in London against, I think it was in London where it happened, against the Mormon Church. It was a big issue. There was a gentleman he and his wife, who were former members of the church in Utah. They left the church and they went to England and did this huge tour talking about how bad the Mormons were and getting people to buy their pamphlets and books and stuff, and listen to their lectures about anti-Mormonism and things. They created quite a stir as well. So there's a lot of this going on that was stirring people up. and increasing the hatred against the Mormons. So in 1910 and 1911, British Parliament opened an investigation into these rumors and supposed practices of the LDS Church. And their investigation concluded there was no basis for these. That's not what was happening. They weren't exclusively going after women. None of their literature showed they were going after women. None of their how they practiced and how they did things were going after women. They had people. They were following missionaries around. People were like going to sacrament meetings, going to church meetings to listen and learn and understand. They were interviewing missionaries, interviewing the people that the missionaries had talked with, lots of stuff. And they couldn't find that they were exclusively there to get women. They were just there to help people become members, men or women. So it was found unfounded. The people who were pushing to get those laws passed could not get the votes to get those laws passed, and so England was still a place where Mormon missionaries were allowed. Winston Churchill, who was not prime minister at the time, he was the leader of the Home Office. So that was his job as the leader of the Home Office, is kind of deal with all the domestic stuff, kind of a Secretary of State type idea. It was his office that did the investigations, and he came back and was like, "Nope, Mormon missionaries are fine. They're okay. We don't need to worry about them. There's these unfounded rumors that are going on, basically." But it didn't stop the people from hating Mormons. There is a tremendous amount of stories of people who were showing up at LDS church worship practices just to disrupt them. Like preachers or others would come in and they'd go up to the front and they would basically just commandeer the podium and then just talk and rail on about how bad Mormonism was and things like that to the congregation. So just completely disrupt their meetings, basically. There would be mobs forming outside the rented spaces where the members were meeting, and they were basically threatening the members. And some were getting tarred and feathered. Some were threatened to be executed and murdered because of their belief. Rocks are being thrown through the windows into the building. Sometimes doors are broken down to get in there. So threats of violence against these places made it hard for members to find areas to rent because the landowner didn't want his place destroyed by the mobs, and so they wouldn't rent to the Mormons sometimes. So Mormons had to kind of move around in different houses, their own houses, to do worship practices in some places. There was actually a story, this was really interesting, that I found of a bunch of anti-Mormon people got together, and as kids were going into class, they literally were just loading them up with candy. They bought a bunch of candy and they were just handing it out to all the Mormon kids as they went into worship services, so that the kids were just wild and crazy and rowdy on the sugar, and it would just totally disrupt the meeting. There was an outside meeting that was held at one point that they had taught a bunch of kids. So there's this mob of a couple hundred people that showed up with a lot of children, and they taught the kids, anytime the word Joseph Smith is mentioned, you scream. So that totally disrupted the services. So oftentimes cops had to be called out to get these protesters out of the church services so the Mormons could actually worship. Man, it was crazy, some of the things that they had to go through. Just so wild what was going on with this. So it was a wild time that was happening. So a lot of people hated the church, a lot of persecution against members of the church. There were people that are like, oh yeah, they're my neighbors, and like their kids would play together, until they found out that their neighbors were Mormon, and they just cut off all communication with them. Just, nope, we ostracize them now. We don't talk to those people because they're Mormon now. It was pretty severe, some of the things that they faced at that time. So that's more of where I think I'm going to put my focus on my paper, is more of those stories, those issues, how when England tried to directly put laws against the church, how it affected church worship and the attitudes and perspectives of the people. So I think I'm going to dial it in a little bit more on that, because it's a fascinating time period to go through. In fact, David O. McKay, interestingly enough, David O. McKay was the mission president in the early 1920s, right after World War I. And he made a comment that the anti-Mormon rhetoric was so bad, especially from that Winifred Graham lady. Like, she was so well known as an anti-Mormon person that he was like, man, if I ever met her, I feel like I just want to punch her in the face. uh, because he was so frustrated with how bad missionary efforts had gotten by that time, basically. So really interesting times. So that's where I'm putting more of my focus and emphasis. But man, you got to hand it to the British Saints. They didn't cross the plains like with the early pioneers and set up Utah and stuff, but man, they still crossed the plains. They still made that big journey of immigration over the ocean and then across the plains in a whole different kind of world than they're used to. But even the saints that stayed, man, did they suffer some persecution. Man, did they struggle to keep things going. And it wasn't until after World War II that the church in England really started to take hold and thrive as people stayed. And we eventually started getting into that second generation of members. And things started to pick up. After World War II, the economy over there started to pick up a little bit more as they're rebuilding their nation, getting back up there. So a lot of prosperity and opportunities, and they were able to get a lot more happening. Temples and church houses and things were going up all over. So they had the temple in Preston, and then they had a London temple later on in the 20th century. So it was really, that's when things really picked up for the saints and really did well. Before then, before, with World War II and the Great Depression and World War I and all those other things, it was really, really hard to be a Latter-day Saint in England. It was a tough time. So that's my research paper that I'm going to keep working on and doing more. So I'll talk more next week about that as well. So in my, Islam's been really fun to study. Let me go into the Islam class for a little bit here. Islam, so we've been studying Islam in India right now. So India is a really fascinating country. Most of India has been historically Hindu. Hindu's the main religion in India. Buddhism emerged as it emerged around the 600s, 700s AD. It started to do a lot in India as well and take hold and bring people in, but it didn't really clash a lot with Hinduism, so it did okay. Sikh religions, other things like that started to emerge. India has always been a place with huge population, and because it's in a main part of the trade routes, it's for economic purposes, India is vital for trade through the Indian Ocean, through South China Seas, all that area. India has always played a very important role with a lot of port cities in there as well. So when the Muslims came into India during the time around the 1600s, if I remember right, 1500s, 1600s, they pushed down in there the Mughal Empire, which was kind of a remnant of the Mongols. They got down into India and controlled a lot of the area, and they were there for quite a while. And then in the 1800s, France and England start to get down into those areas and say, we want a piece of this economic pie. We want to deal with these things that are going on down here as well. Most people don't realize that that's where tea became very popular in England, is after England started to interact more in India. And India got a lot of it from China as well. So that's where the influence of tea really came from. As England and France wanted a piece of this part of the world, the Southern Asian part of the world, they did a lot of colonial ideas, imperialism, basically using their military might to get into places and to dominate and control those areas. They saw the Indian people as not primitive, but as disorganized, not as civilized as the British were. And so they decided we need to modernize this country that seems kind of backwards, kind of an early Orientalist approach to India. So at this time, India has a lot of Hindus, but also Muslims in there as well, from the Mughal Empire. Muslims have always historically been a minority in India, but they usually end up retaining power. That happened until the British came in, and then the British eventually were kicked out, and India went back to Hinduism after that. But during the time of British power, there was a lot of fighting. France and England were doing a lot of fighting in this area to take over lands. The problem was, is France also had a war going on in America. And as they came down from Canada and to take over areas in America, so when you think of like Napoleon, he had helped secure a bunch of land from the Spaniards and others in America, but then he's also doing these wars against France, uh, or France against England type ideas, because Napoleon was French, he wasn't British. That he there was just a lot of fighting going on, so France decided, look, we've got too many places we're fighting in. Let's just give up India. So they surrendered India, and the British took it over, and they dealt more with their American assets and other places as well. So British took over a lot of India at that point, and then ruled it. Now the problem is they they saw these Muslim and Hindu groups as um, not civilized, and so it's like, we need to modernize them. We need to take this backward society and improve them. They've screwed all this up. It's so wrong. So they imposed that they were right and the Indians were wrong, and imposed their ideas on them, basically, which was common through that time period. So what they did, it was interesting. They changed a lot of stuff, which took a lot of land away from Muslims. They took a lot of rights and opportunities away from Muslims in India. But if you lived in northwest India, today what we would call present-day Pakistan, you had a lot of extra rights. The British military wanted you to own land. They wanted you to have an army. They wanted you to do things, whereas the rest of India, they were demilitarizing all the Muslim groups. They were taking land away from Muslim groups. They were changing how things ran, and that severely disadvantaged the Muslims in the rest of India. But why up in the Pakistan area did they favor the Muslims? Well, that's because that area, which borders up against Afghanistan, is also directly south from Russia. And as Russia was expanding east and dealing with China and up into Mongolia and those places, they're also pushing south so they could get some of the port areas along the Indian Ocean. So going through Afghanistan and down through India would have been a great way to further their empire. And the British were afraid that if Russia took India, Russia would be unstoppable with their fleets, with the opportunities to move trade around, to have an influence in the economies of the area. And they excuse me, they saw Russia as a massive threat to the British Empire. And so they used the Muslims in northwest India as a shield against Russian progression. And so they favored the Muslims up there, gave them plenty of opportunities so they could use them as a shield, basically to keep Russia from coming into India. Well, that worked for a while. Then when Russia kind of backed off and didn't go down that route anymore, these Muslims are like, hey, we want to kind of break off again and not be a part of British rule. And because the British are like, okay, we don't need you guys as much, so we're going to impose more restrictions. And they're like, hey, you guys are like changing the rules on us. This is baloney. We want to break off and be our own country. And British is like, nope, you can't. And so the British actually went in there to fight them. And one thing they did that was interesting is they actually used the Sikh warriors against the Muslims in northwest India, aka present-day Pakistan. And they used the Sikhs to defeat these groups up in that area and took it over. And then they used them in other areas as well. So some of the Muslim groups were going through these uprisings in the 1800s to get rid of British rule from them. And they weren't super successful at doing that. Some Muslim groups decided we need to find a way to work with the British Empire to make this happen so that they could have some autonomy and opportunities versus resist against them. So there's some different opinions and ideas within the Muslim community of what to do with these British overlords that they had in India. You may be familiar with the term called the East India Trading Company or East India Company. England couldn't rule India and that area very well by themselves, so they created a corporation that would run it for them. It was a big company that was sponsored by the British Empire that would run India, and that was the East India Company. And if you're familiar with your Pirates of the Caribbean movies, you know that in that, it wasn't the final movie, it was one before. The second to last movie, I think, was the one on when they're dealing with, no, it was, which one was that one? It was either the third or fourth movie, I can't remember now, but it was the one where the Dutch East India Company comes in, Lord Beckett, tries to take over everything, and he gets he wants the heart of Davy Jones to control Davy Jones and all those kinds of things. Um, that's that's kind of going into those stories and ideas of this East India Company. So eventually, by around the 1870s, England realized the East India Company was corrupt and was not doing so well, causing lots of famines and mismanagement of India. So the British Empire then took over uh, control of India at that point, basically, and kind of edged out the East India Trading Company, started phasing all that out around the 1870s timeframe. So that put more British direct rule in India. But again, some of the Muslim groups didn't like it. They didn't want the British to be there. And we know eventually the British leave, and the India becomes its own sovereign nation at some point. We're not quite there yet. But it's so amazing to think of all these shifts and changes that have happened as Islam spread. Now, Islam is not a race of people. Islam is a religious philosophy that people from all over the world subscribe to. So it's really interesting how these different groups intermingled, how some of them stayed very separate, like we're going to be really fundamentalist. We're not going to mingle our beliefs and ideas with yours. Others, like into Sufism and mysticism in Islam, started to merge them together. So some meditative Hindu practices started finding their way into Islamic worship practices and so forth, because they were creating these hybrid versions. So when we think of the diversity of Islam down in the India and in through the islands areas, Indonesia and things, there was a huge amount of variation in Islam that really happened as they ran into these other groups and other philosophies that were out there. And sometimes it was just better to work together with them rather than work against them. So really interesting how that area has developed over time and how much Islam has impacted the history of these areas and what it has done. So really fascinating, some fun stuff to learn, different parts of history that you don't necessarily get to hear a whole lot about in your world history classes in America. So it's been fun to kind of fill out the gaps in history that you don't get a lot in American schools. So it's been fun. So just real quickly on my mediation class, just to keep you up to date on that, a lot of what we've been doing lately is practicing not just the pre-mediation, but actual mediation. Like, what do you do when you get the two people in the room and you start to talk with them and work with them? Everybody starts with their stories. This is the story of what happened. Here's my position on why I'm right and they're wrong, those kinds of things. But underneath that is the values. What is it that you value that is driving that story? So we'd like to try to understand those values and even get into beliefs and ideas that are deeper in of what do you believe about yourself and about what's going on in this conflict that is influencing this? What are your worldviews, those kinds of perceptions? So as a mediator, if you do if you do transactional type mediation, you kind of stay at the story level and go, okay, what do you want? What do you want? What are you willing to give up to make this happen? How do I make this work? Let's just find an agreement you guys are willing to put up with, and then we'll get it in writing and get it good. That's transactional mediation. Transformational mediation is looking at the stories and go, okay, here's your stories. Here's your values. What do you value in your life that's driving these stories? What are the beliefs and worldviews you have that influence your values that are driving these stories? And how can we help the two of you see each other as valuable? You might not get back together, but let's at least make sure you do not have a negative effect on your relationship from this. Let's help you to see, yeah, they have some valid points. I'm part of the conflict. They're part of the conflict. We need to work together to get this resolved. So it's not just coming to some kind of a legal agreement. Transformative mediation is, how do we help heal the relationship problems? Even if they don't get back together, but how do we help make sure that they're amicable with each other and not hating each other? So that's where the deeper work comes in transformational mediation. I did go to a conference last Saturday and had a great time learning more about it and helping, actually. We got to go down as a class to help be role players for professional mediators who were learning transformational mediations so they were getting a certification in it too. And it was fun to talk with them and chat with them and see what are they doing and how does that work with what they've got. It was really fun, really good opportunity to meet some more professionals. So when dealing with mediations, realize that people have perspectives and ideas. There are reasons that they believe the way they believe. And it's important to understand those reasons. What are their values? What are their worldviews that are shaping their beliefs and ideas around this conflict? The more you can think about those ideas and start to see them as in the same boat as you, the easier it will be to find a solution to help you overcome this and not have a negative effect on you anymore from that conflict. So conflict is around us. Conflict happens all the time around us. Sometimes it turns into major issues. Most of the time it either gets ignored or it doesn't turn into a big issue. But it's good to realize that it's important for us to understand that conflict or disagreements with people happen. It's not an uncommon thing, and it's okay. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to not see eye to eye, but it's not okay to devalue their opinion because it's different than yours. And that's the thing that's important to always look at is they may disagree with me, but it doesn't mean they're less of a person than me because of that disagreement. So those are good things to always think about to help us in dealing with conflicts and issues we have. So lots of more homework to do, lots of studying, lots of things to work on. One more thing I forgot on my Islam class. This is so interesting, so wild to think about. Dogs and Islam. I mean, something I never thought about. We had to do like an extra credit report on something like a topic in Islam, and one of the topics that our professor gave us was pet ownership in Islam. And so I looked at dogs. Dogs are not allowed to be owned in Islam, with some exceptions. Okay, so in Islam, they have the Quran. Okay, we've talked about that. That's the book of scripture it's a compilation of the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad. We have the Hadith, which is stories about the life of the Prophet Muhammad and how he taught and applied the teachings of the Quran to the people. Those are the two sacred books of scripture that everything is based on pretty much in Islam. From there, you have religious leaders, the ulama, who take the Hadith and the Quran and they look at these writings and ideas and they declare what are called a fatwa. A fatwa is a religious declaration. So somebody has a question and like, can I own a dog? And they look at it and say, no, you can't. The Quran says this, and the Hadith it says this. You can't own a dog. So it's really interesting to see there's a lot of these fatwas, these religious declarations that talk about dog ownership. Now, I found a professor at Yale University that had written a book about the history of dogs in Islam. And in his writings that he says that actually dogs were favored and were an important part of Islamic culture in the early days of Islam. So back then, 600s, 700s, 800s, 900s AD timeframe, dogs were helpful. They were used as protection. So you could keep aggressive animals at bay by having a dog. They were used in military combat sometimes as a way to keep people away. They're good early warning detection because they have a good sense of hearing and things. Dogs also protected your farm animals, and they would help you herd your sheep. So dogs had farm responsibilities. Dogs had protection responsibilities that were very helpful for you. To own, and those are the main reason to have a dog. Basically, you use them for protection. You use it for farming farming help. Those are the main reasons you can have a dog in Islam. It can't stay in your home, and it can't go in the room where you do your regular prayers, because that would make them unclean. The challenge is as society modernized over time, the society started to improve the sanitation of the area. So dogs not only kept rats away, but dogs would also eat all the scrap food that the humans would not eat. You'd eat your dinner, you'd throw the rest out. Dogs would eat the rest of it. And so it kept it basically improved sanitation. Dogs were a function of sanitation in these ancient cities. As sanitation modernized and improved, and they had the humans were able to take care of their own sanitation, dogs were now seen as trash eaters. So they were spreaders of disease. And so they really pushed against this idea of having dogs in your home because they could spread disease, and they usually get all that saliva on their mouths and they flip it around and drool all over you and things. So they wanted to keep your prayer areas clean and pure and not get germs on your hands from the dogs and the saliva and stuff. So they banned them, basically. You can have them you can't have it as a pet, like a lap dog or things like how modern people look at dogs today would not work in Islam, basically. That's against the rules. Now, when you look at what is the severity of these rules, it's really interesting because you don't get excommunicated from Islam for owning a dog. But what happens is in Islam, there's this concept of rewards. Whenever you do a good deed, in heaven, they record a reward. So think of every time you do something good, you get a +1 in heaven. Every time you do something bad, you get a -1. And so these add up. And if you have way more +1s than -1s, you end up going to paradise, which is heaven. So almost a works-based type idea around salvation. But here's the interesting thing, okay? Now, if you do your prayer worship, you get like up to 700 good deeds recorded for that one prayer. So when you do your regular worship practices, that amplifies your good deeds and does well. Owning a dog, as it says, and this is actually in the, I believe it's in the Hadith, it talks about this, that owning a dog would subtract a mountain of good deeds off your list. So having a dog has such a negative effect on your deeds that dog ownership may actually keep you out of heaven. That's bad. There's no way to overcome it unless you get rid of the dog. So they ask a lot of questions in these fatwas, like, can I breed dogs? No, you can't breed dogs. What about emotional support animals? Nope, dogs are not allowed as emotional support animals in Islam. What if you're blind and you need a seeing eye dog? That is actually allowed. You can do that, and if somebody has a dog and they want to come over to your home, that's allowed to have them there. Just be really careful how you treat those dogs and handle those things. So it's really interesting to study that this week and understand what is that idea around pet ownership in Islam. So there are some restrictions around dog ownership. It is possible as for an Islamic family to have a dog, but only under very strict guidelines can you have it. And if you violate those guidelines, it can be severely detrimental to your ability to get to heaven. So rather severe consequences for pet ownership in Islam. It's pretty wild that when I was reading some of those edicts and rules. So something fascinating that I've learned this week, and hopefully you guys are enjoying these videos as well. If you have questions, put in the comments. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation there. And if not, we'll see you next week.